the sugar rush of impact factors and publications. Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult because publications give you this perfect, very easily countable metric. You got this many, and they're in these publications which are seen as being good. Therefore, you're this good. And if we take that away, then people are worried about, well, how are we going to measure what good means?
That's Simon Hettrick from the Hidden Rev, a UK-based initiative that wants to give all scientific output, be that an article, a piece of software or digital data, a fair chance of getting recognized and valued, not to mention the people that make all of that happen. As researchers, we know only too well that an important part of our work is to share what we do and, of course, what comes out of it with other people. Not least because our results can be reused, or at least we hope it will be, by other researchers, or that it may be of general public interest, or the fact that what we did should be independently verified to see if it actually makes sense. I mean, after all, we are all human, and mistakes do happen, and science, of course, is no exception. But there is also another important reason for sharing the fruits of our labours. All research depends on funding, whether it's private or public money, and funders want to know that the money is well spent. In short, the output of our work gets assessed. In the UK, public funders do that every 7 years in an exercise called the Research Excellence Framework. And this takes us right into the heart of the matter. How do you assess the work from researchers? Well, until recent years, the go-to place for this has been, and still is, the scientific article. And not just the article, but which journal it gets published in, and how many others quote the article in their own papers, all of which form part of the so-called impact factor. A factor that plays a crucial role in the evaluation of scientific output. And as Simon said at the beginning, that is a known quantity, a well-established process, and universities and publishers just love it. But a PDF as an output is not the only thing that comes out of a research project, is it? For instance, there often is software, bespoke software, that's produced to get to the results in the first place. Then there are the digital data, not to mention experimental setups in some research projects like complex machines or supercomputers, and. And so for a number of years, researchers and increasingly funders have been asking the question whether the research article is really the best way, leave alone the only way, to evaluate the work and output of a research project. One of which is, as I mentioned earlier, the Hidden Rev initiative in the UK that Simon Hettrick is part of, and I hand over to Simon in a second. But if you do want to include, say, software in the evaluation process, well, how do you actually do it? What criteria should you use? And who should do it? At this stage, I don't think we have definitive answers for these questions, but I wanted to put them to my 3 guests in this episode, Simon Hettrick for one, Will Swansborough-Aston and Jack Atkinson. Each of them brings a unique perspective to the table, but first let's hear from Simon. I met him last year, that is 2025, at the RSE conference in Coventry in the UK, where he gave a keynote presentation on his work at Hidden Rev. And just afterwards, I pinned him down to talk to me about the reasons for starting the initiative in the first place and how it can help with changing research culture. Evaluation, I think that is something that people need to get their head around, because I don't really understand how exactly that works. Okay, you hand in papers. To 98% people hand in papers. And who's looking at it, and how often does this happen, and what's the result of it? How does it impact research?
All right. Well, there are two parts to this. So the first part is just it's research culture in general and its focus on the publication as the only metric of research success. That's the thing we actually want to change, because it's the research culture, it's the culture and environment within universities that kind of fosters the way that the research is done. It promotes certain job families and suppresses other ones. It adds weird incentive structures to the way that we do research. So we're not actually doing the things that I think we should care about in research. We're paper chasing. We're looking for more and more publications and only publications. Yeah, and that leads to discussions about things like impact factors and all that work. So that's the wider culture part. Now, Hidden Ref is trying to make that point using the REF, the Research Excellence Framework, which, this is an international podcast, isn't it? So I should probably explain what that means.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what I was leading to. So, because, many people outside the UK will wonder what the hell the REF is.
And many people within the UK wonder what the hell the REF is as well. And that's one of the issues, right? Okay, so the Research Excellence Framework, it takes place every 7 years. It's the way the government basically looks at the research output from universities and works out, whether they're doing good research or not.
Now, and if they get money for it.
Now, that's the key part, right? Universities sign up to a hell of a lot of things that they say are important to them, but the cynical part of me says, actually, they don't really care about a lot of those things. They just know they should sign up to them. The Research Excellence Framework, the REF, they really treat that seriously because it's worth £2 billion per year. So on the results of your REF return, you get a cut of this £2 billion per year. So universities treat it really, really seriously. And that's why we use that as the way of identifying this problem with research culture. And I can talk more about how we do that.
Before we go into that, let's talk about money. Is that 2 billion nationwide or England-wide?
I believe that's nationwide.
It's nationwide.
So it's Research England that runs the REF, but it's a national project, and the 2 billion is dispersed across 157 universities, if memory serves. And it's interesting, you can look at the breakdown. A lot of terms that nobody cares about here, right? It's quality-related funding, so QR funding. And basically you can look at how that's distributed, and the big universities, the big name ones, get quite a lot of that money, and the smaller universities take a smaller cut. And it's quite an interesting drop-off as you look across the REF results. But yes, dispersed over the UK.
All right, okay. It's dispersed over the UK, but now you want to talk about the quality or the research itself and the evaluation.
You see, the thing is, I'd been working with research software engineers. It's a job family I think you know pretty well.
Yeah, kind of.
So I'd been working with research software engineers, and the thing that I thought was remarkable was it was so difficult getting them valued at first. Right? As soon as we started getting the numbers together, then we had an army. We had our own private army, and that made culture change in the UK.
Yeah.
But when you first started talking to people, when I first started talking to people about research software engineers, you could see that it's a difficult argument. It was difficult to persuade universities that they needed to do things like start new career pathways or have other ways of judging success. And that's because research software engineers produce software. It's software that fundamentally underpins all research, but they're not actually writing papers. And universities are so set up to look at papers as the only metric of research success that they were overlooking the software. That led me to look into the REF for the first time, and that's where I, for the first time, realised just how badly skewed, and UK universities in this example, are towards and using publication metrics as the only metric of success. But it's something that I've now seen is entirely happens all around the world. All advanced research economies suffer from this problem too.
Yeah, exactly, because that's what led me to the discussion of the impact factor, because that's how people are being assessed in terms of funding, which is really important, obviously, for research, because otherwise there wouldn't be a research project, at least not publicly funded. They would have to look for it elsewhere, who probably also are looking at impact factors. But it's a little bit like sugar, isn't it? It's a little bit like a drug that's getting very difficult to get away from. And so how do you actually take people off the sugar rush of papers and impact factors?
The sugar rush of impact factors and publications. Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult because publications give you this perfect, very easily countable metric. You got this many, and they're in these publications which are seen as being good, therefore you're this good. And if we take that away, then people are worried about, well, how are we going to measure what good means? What we've found when we move to looking at other, what we call NTOs, not traditionally submitted outputs, so that's software and data, but it's also things like exhibitions and patents and performances and all manner of other research outputs, all of the other stuff that happens in research. When we get people to actually do assessments of those, they actually fall into it quite naturally. They quickly start putting together mental maps of how, what good looks like. They create heuristics. All of these sort of things happen quite naturally. And we've been running these NTO workshops at universities around the UK, and one of the things that's always said is people say, I thought this was going to be difficult, and it's not. So we can change research culture. We have the skills in universities to be able to assess other things. It's just there's no pressure to do it, and that's where the hidden ref comes in. We're kind of applying that pressure.
Right. So hidden ref, and this is really what I want to get to next, is the history of it all, because, the ref exists for a while. I don't know when the first one was, actually.
Well, so it's existed in some form since 1986.
It was rebranded.
and it's been rebranded a number of times.
Yeah.
The form where you can get the data easily has existed since 2008.
Right, okay. But what actually led up to the hidden ref?
So this was me worrying about how could we get software valued, and I thought, well, we'll use the ref. And I wasn't ref returnable. There's a whole lot of politics, so much politics around the ref. Who's in, who's out, who's important, who's not. Right? If you want to really reinstate or reinforce a two-tier system, then the way that the ref is dealt with in universities is definitely that. So I started looking at the outputs category. So part of the submission, you look at all of your research outputs. I looked at it. There are 21 different categories of output, and it includes all the stuff you'd expect, publications, journal publications, parts of books and things, and then lots of things you didn't expect. And I was thinking, well, if I'm clever, if I can get my policy work to actually have some impact, I'll sneak software into it somehow or another, and that'll force universities to have to think about the importance of software. Then I looked at the list. It's already there. You don't believe how professionally embarrassing that was for me. This is 2019.
You thought you discovered something. No, I wasn't the first.
But 2019, I've been in the field since 2007. I'm head of policy at the Software Sustainability Institute, and I didn't know software was already in our national research assessment program. So that was embarrassing. But then I realized what I've discovered is a treasure trove of information about what universities sort of see as important when it comes to software. What does good look like across the entire UK? So I plotted it, looked at the outputs, got the data, did the analysis as you do. 186,000 outputs in the ref in 2021. And do you know how many went into the software category?
Less than 1% or...
11.
Less than 1%.
So one of my favourite things for doing with policymakers at the moment is trying to get that skew across to them. So like currently I would say, if you think of publications as the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the entire world, software is a matchbox sitting on its side. That's the difference in scale.
But it's a whole change of culture, isn't it, that you need to bring about. So how does the hidden ref then trying to do that?
So the first thing is just by awareness raising. So lots of people, you'll go and talk to them, and I was saying earlier on about, not many people in the UK know about the ref. Well, they don't. It's very difficult to get into. It's a huge amount of information.
Not everybody in the university actually is involved in contributing to the ref, isn't it?
No, not everybody is involved in contributing to the ref, but many more people could be if they knew and they were pushing to be involved. And now, thanks to some of our campaigning, the rules have been changed so that all staff members who take part in research can contribute outputs to the next ref in 2029. It was previously people on academic contracts only. So you can you can be an RSE or a technician, a librarian, whatever it is, as long as you've actually contributed to the research, you can contribute that output to the next ref.
Okay, so it's a question then getting the people to contribute actively.
That's where the awareness raising comes in. And as I say, we try and make the ref rules and the politics around it more accessible. Currently, you have to go to the website, you have to do a lot of reading. I worked out for the 2021 ref, it would take you 15 solid days of reading 7 hours a day to read your way through all of the sort of publications that the ref produce, never mind all of the stuff that goes
Which, of course, no one is doing.
No. No, nobody's doing that. Very, very few people. No, I know a few people, Gemma Derrick Eric, who I work with, is self-confessed ref nerd, you know, like she knows. So what we try and do is we try and get the important stuff out there. So the important stuff for me is things like, well, actually, there's more than one category of output that you can submit to the ref. So we get that news out there, and then we make it more apparent that people can take part and actually can lobby within their own universities to be involved in the ref and to have their work represented in it. I like the idea of changing the ref. Right? It's coming up in 2029. But the thing I really care about is changing local university policies around who's celebrated for contributing to research. So even if we have no impact on the ref, if we can change university policies, that'd be amazing.
But I think the ref has changed, because I do remember there was a hidden ref festival, and there's now going to be another one. At the time of recording, there will be another one in Birmingham coming up. But there was one in 23, I think, in Bristol. And I remember that someone from Research England actually presented, making the point that, yes, there is the ability to actually allow non-paper output like software and others. So it's the universities where the kind of bottleneck and sticky points are.
So that was Stephen Hill who was presenting. He's the director of Research England. And we got him to the Festival Hidden Ref. And that shows how Research England see this work. They have been trying for a long time to get a more diverse range of outputs to be adopted within universities, because they know all of this stuff's important. I mean, you'd have to be crazy to argue that software wasn't important to research, but you look at a university's ref return and it appears that way.
Yeah.
So they've always been very, very supportive of this work and actively campaigning to support it. I was invited, along with some others, to the Future of Research Assessment Programme, which was the thing they do after the previous ref in 2021, when they were setting up for the 2029. And I went into that meeting. I went into that meeting prepared for a fight.
And did you get one?
No. No, I didn't. Because everybody's like, yeah, it's a brilliant idea. We definitely should be doing it. And they'd already thought of it themselves. And the people from Research England are entirely supportive of it. What happens is they write the guidelines to try and make these changes happen. Then they impact the solid granite of university policy. And universities, partially understandably, because they don't have their limited resources and all that sort of stuff, but universities aren't following the new guidelines.
So this is where you're moving next to actually make the universities follow the new guidelines, make them aware there are new guidelines. But I think it's one thing to make them aware there are new guidelines. It's also changing the mindset.
Absolutely. So, I still don't know what the answer is here, right? You go and find out about these policies and okay, so the funder and the people who are running the evaluation process, the ref, they're all behind it, great. And then you go to a university and you talk to the top brass and you talk to the people who put the ref submissions together, and they're all like, it's a great idea. And you're like, well, so who is it then that's stopping it from happening? And the thing that stops it from happening is the gestalt, it's like all of these things working together. Because there are so many policies where, that needs to be tweaked, that needs to be changed, that person doesn't need to be doing that. It's actually just so difficult moving these deeply flawed human systems, which universities are, actually shifting them on. So really, for us, it's about making the argument, making it again, pushing, finding out where there's a restriction. So assessment guidelines for software, there aren't any. Well, let's write some. That sort of stuff. Just working on that over and over again. This is a 7-year process. The ref takes place every 7 years. I really hope we'll have a big shift in the next ref, but it's the one after this one that I think is going to be the really impactful one.
After the next one, after 29, the one after that.
Which will be 2036.
Okay, well.
And I'm like, at what point am I going to retire?
Well, I'm definitely going to be retired by then. But anyway, but it's it's a big ship and it takes some time to actually turn it around. Do you actually see the hidden ref as an extension of the RSE movement?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, RSE showed us the way. So RSE was all about campaigning for a role that was fundamentally important, but unrecognised. That's what we're doing time and time again. We're campaigning either for fundamentally important outputs that are unrecognised, or, and this has always been interesting to me, lots of other vital but unrecognised roles. We call them hidden roles.
Technicians, librarians, etc.
Librarians, data stewards. There's about 26 now on the Hidden Ref website.
Oh, right.
Academia is good at two things: writing publications and creating vital but unrecognised roles.
So the hidden ref is obviously you're trying to get the needle change for 29, but you already kind of admitted that it's probably not going to change that much. Is that what the expectation
I
is?
I've admitted that. I've said I think greater impact will be in the next one, but I think we will make a significant change to this ref. So what we want to do, and get this as a manifesto, we've got the 5% manifesto. Now that's the kind of number that gets you out in the morning, isn't it? 5%.
Well, yeah. That sounds exciting, doesn't it?
Yeah. What do we want? 5%. Now, when do we want it? I don't know. At some point in the future. It's not a huge number, but the point is we want 5% of outputs to be submitted to not traditionally submitted output categories in the next ref. That's because 5% is over double what is currently being submitted. It's 2.4%. We have that sort of manifesto to try and sort of drive things on, and that's certainly a target we would definitely like to hit.
But, I mean, it's more than the 11 that you got years ago, isn't it? So the 2.5% now.
I mean, there's lots of other, there are, it's about 5 categories out of that 21 ref categories that have the submissions, and everything else is 0. So, you've got, I think it was 38 data and databases at the same time in the last ref.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
There's a handful of things that just are completely overlooked. So, yes, we want to change that. But the big thing for us is that we got funded, and this is wonderful. So,
right, when did that happen?
So that started January this year in 2025, and it came from Research England, which is the funder that runs the ref. So again, that reinforces just what they think is the right direction for things to go in. Up until then, we'd been a volunteer organisation, so we were entirely relying on people.
But that's what I remember. So from Bristol, that you were volunteering. Yeah. Simon and his colleagues James Baker and Gemma Derrick actually created a podcast and YouTube channel, which I recommend you listen to if you want to find out more about their work at Hidden Ref or how the ref assessment works in general. You'll find the podcast under the very snappy title of What the Ref. And the other side of the coin are, as Simon already hinted at, the universities who are often charged with the task to submit research output to funding agencies, whether it's the so-called ref in the UK or another process in your country. And this brings me to Will Swansborough-Aston from the University of Exeter. And Will is working on exactly that, collecting research output from various departments and helping to select those that will be used for evaluation. And in the following chat, I wanted to find out from Will what actually goes on behind the scenes. How does this process work in practice? And also to touch on the question of what's stopping universities from using other material than articles for the assessment, like, for instance, software. So here's Will.
Hi, I'm Will Swansborough-Aston, and I'm a Research and Impact Coordinator with a sort of specific focus on REF 2029 at the University of Exeter.
And that's exactly what we want to talk about, because you're actually one of the people working at a university collecting the material for submissions for the Research Excellence Framework. Am I getting this right?
Yes, yeah, that's kind of part of the job. I think that's a sort of bigger part the closer we get to the submission date. But submissions for REF aren't just a single sample that you take in 2028, for example. We have to be collecting that sort of information continuously, so we're not overloading ourselves right up until the deadline.
So from a university perspective, how does this work? You're saying you're doing this continuously.
I mean, I guess the approach may change between universities. I can't speak for all universities. I only have experience of this from an Exeter viewpoint. There is such a huge amount going into this submission that it'd be impossible to do in a single year right up until the deadline. So the REF is sort of a sampling exercise, right? The sort of the generation of quality research and impact is ongoing in the background, normally from universities, just through the structures that are in place on sort of research culture and things like that. The REF is effectively taking out the highlights of that to show what we're doing as a university that is world leading and so on and so forth. The sort of sampling of that, I think we have to submit a couple of thousand outputs, 2,500 outputs-ish.
Wow. So it's in 2,500 outputs. Okay.
Yeah, and that's obviously only 1/3 of the sort of REF submission in terms, because you obviously have the sort of output side of things. You have the submission of impact, which is done through impact case studies. And then you also have the what is now people, culture and environment, but was previously environment, which is kind of a little bit up in the air. We're still awaiting the final guidance, because if the listeners are aware or not aware, but we're currently in a 3-month pause on REF guidance while they sort of iron out some of the creases and see what the final decision making is going to be. So yeah, our submission will take up about 2,500 outputs, I think 100 and something case studies. And then each unit of assessment will have to submit their own sort of PCE component as well. So there's a hell of a lot of work going on to sample all of that information. If you gave yourself a year to find the 2,500 best outputs across 34 disciplines, or we submit to 26, I think.
That's going to be a tight thing.
Yeah, it would be an impossible task. That even with all the manpower in the world, it would be incredibly tight. So our approach is effectively to sort of have this sampling in the background. So we take yearly samples of outputs, asking, it's sort of the nominations process. So asking the research staff to submit their best outputs that they think should be reviewed internally. This is technically separate to the ref. This is just a way for staff to get an internal peer review of some of their outputs and see what is strong about it, what is weak about it. And it's sort of a research quality exercise independent of the ref.
Right.
That said, it still feeds into the ref because of the papers that are, or the outputs generally that are reviewed, when things are identified as being 3 or 4 star, they will start to feed into what we would identify as a ref sort of submission.
Okay, so let's stop there a little bit, because there is the kind of evaluation itself. So you have the submission where you say, okay, over the 7 years period, we're not waiting until the last year before we actually collect 2,500 outputs. We're going to do this on a continuous basis. And then there is the rating of it, which is, I think, 1 to 4 stars, isn't it?
Yes, and there's also the classification of U for ungraded, which is basically where, for an output, say it doesn't qualify as a research. It's
right, okay.
Not sufficient quality.
So there are 5 ratings. So 1 which is unclassified, and then there are 4 stars.
Yeah.
Okay. How does this rating then work? Is that the people sit together? Is it left to the department to rate their own stuff? Or is there some internal reviewer within Exeter University that says, okay, you may rate it 4 star, but I'm rating it only 3 or 2? 1 star being the lowest rating and 4 star being the highest rating.
Yeah, so it's effectively all done through peer review, the same way that REF is. Research England will convene their panels for each UOA and each main panel, and all of that assessment will be done by peer review, so that is kind of mirrored internally at the university. So I guess it's the same way that journals work, and everything is kind of done through peer review because it's sort of the best assessment of research quality we have, lacking any sort of automatic tools. Peer review is the sort of the gold standard. So it's sort of devolved to departments and UOAs in that sense, in a bit of a sticky situation where departments and UOAs don't align perfectly. We could have several departments feeding into a single UOA, or one department feeding into several UOAs. It goes both ways. So we account for that in the nomination system, where staff can say, oh, this is best suited to this unit assessment. And then it's kind of sent through to departments to do some internal peer reviewing.
Right.
And those are managed locally because as a sort of central professional services team, there are a load of nuances that are discipline specific that we could possibly capture. My background's in chemistry, so I come at this from a very physical sciences point of view. Obviously, for some of the more humanitarian or social sciences disciplines, those norms and things around review are very, very different, or can be very, very different. And that's before you even get on to sort of thinking about outputs that aren't just a journal article.
This is a very nice segue into what I want to talk about next, which is non-traditional outputs. And you've been to the Hidden Ref Festival in Birmingham, and the Hidden Ref is trying to encourage people to submit material and research outputs that are not publications, the journal articles, which is, I think, according to the statistics that they provide, sort of still 98%, and they want to lower that down to 95% and 5% non-traditional research output. But from your perspective, how is that actually working? Are people willing to do that? Does it take some arm twisting, or how do you encourage people to actually submit something other than a PDF?
It's an infinitely complicated picture, I think, and it's great. It's great that we have the Hidden Ref now have that funding from Research England to really pursue this, because this isn't a case where it's just all of a sudden we should try and submit non-traditional outputs. We've seen progressively since, I think it was RSE 2008, I want to say, the number of publication-based outputs, the journal article outputs, have increased. So it was about 94% in 2008 versus 98%, as you said, for the last ref in 2021. And I think there's kind of 2 prongs of this. The sort of generation and support of non-traditional outputs is its own facet of that. How do we support the generation of them? How do we make sure that these things are recognised? Purely from a physical sciences lens, the amount of papers that will have a journal article associated with them, but will be backed up by software or a very large database that's sort of curated and things. There are a lot of these sorts of non-traditional outputs that exist but aren't recognised as being refable, for lack of a better term. And then there's the challenge around assessing them. We're all very structured in the sort of the academic world where we know how the assessment system works, right? When we're submitting a journal article, we know it's going to be peer reviewed. We know exactly what the peer reviewers will be looking for. That is a bit cloudy and murky with the non-traditional output, because Are you judging the quality of so if it's a piece of software, are you judging like how well the software is made, or are you judging the research question behind the software and how well it answers that? Again, it's great to have a resource from the Hidden Ref where they're pushing for, how do we assess these things? How can we assess these things better? How can we not fall into the traps that we do fall into when reviewing journal articles and things? It's very much in its sort of infancy across a lot of universities, and Exeter's no different, where there will be a lot of work to go into it to say, we would like to submit more non-traditional outputs, really value that, but disseminating that through the academic community through communications is a challenge. But then also picking out things where, it's one thing to have a sort of hidden ref where they know what they're doing with the assessment, they're trying to shift the paradigm and train the trainer. But on, like I said, about our approach to like regular sampling of research quality, how do you then translate a separate body of experts in assessing non-traditional outputs? How do you bring them in and train all of your normal reviewers? Because often we have like whole departments involved in review. So how do you make sure everyone is available to assess a non-traditional output? Or how do you make sure you have that knowledge base? Because, a lot of non-traditional outputs are sort of agnostic of discipline, where a piece of software can be generated, sure, by physical scientists for a physical scientist purpose, but also have that in humanities. And assessing the quality of a piece of software isn't necessarily discipline specific. Assessing the research question is.
Did you have then some examples in Exeter where somebody submitted in the last few years non-traditional output? Let's take software as an example.
I'm not sure. So I think our non-traditional output submissions to the last ref was about 0.9% of our total submissions. So we are below the average of 2%, for sure. And I think that's true for a lot of sort of Russell Group universities. There's the element of risk in submitting non-traditional outputs from the academics point of view, right? Where if you're worried about the quality profile of your unit of assessment, you might not submit a non-traditional output because you're worried it might not be assessed as 4-star, whereas a journal article describing the non-traditional output or, containing the non-traditional output might be. But I think it's something we would like to be quite progressive on. Like I said, with it being sort of two facets of generating and supporting the generation of non-traditional outputs and assessing them, it's going to be a sort of interdisciplinary in a way that it's going to cut across many professional services branches. I sit here with a very ref-centric hat on. It's going to require support from library services. It's going to require support from the research culture team to sort of really bring about a proper culture change around non-traditional outputs.
Jack Atkinson is a researcher and research software engineer at the University of Cambridge in the UK. And at the RSE Conference 2024 in Newcastle, he talked about publishing software as articles or to publish it as an executable article. It's a little bit of a different way of what the Hidden Ref does, or shall I say, an additional way of getting the work on research software recognized as valuable research output. Like Simon, I met with Jack during last year's RSE conference in Coventry, and here he is.
So I'm a senior research software engineer at the University of Cambridge, specifically in the Institute of Computing for Climate Science. And so I suppose my background, like many people in research software engineering, I was a researcher, an academic. So I'd worked within the university in engineering, geography, and also some time at the Antarctic Survey. And sort of I found that as I was working using software to do my research, I was becoming interested not only in sort of the research that was being done with it, but also in how we could write good software, be robust, not fall over, be able to be handed on to someone else. I think this was all before I'd even come across research software engineering as a concept. And it was when one of my friends actually moved into being a research software engineer themselves, I realised there was this entire community of people who really cared about all of these things I cared about, as well as doing the research. And so I sort of decided to give it a go to see if that was something I enjoyed. And I'm still here, sort of 3-4 years later, so it's not going too badly.
We met at a RSE conference, actually, in Newcastle, where I think you were one of the two first presenters of the Emerging Voices. And he talked about publications.
Yeah.
Publications and software. And I think that's what I want to talk to you about, because publication obviously is important in science for a number of reasons, for sharing knowledge, but also for evaluating projects and therefore funding and finances, and etc. But with software, it's always a little bit tricky, or with software in the sense that either as a standalone product, you write a library or you write an application, how do you actually, a scientific one, and how do you publish that? But also, more importantly, perhaps and more frequently, is the use of software in existing scientific projects. So could you give us a rundown from your perspective what the problems are and what you're proposing?
It's good, and I think a bit of background to that is, as I said, I came from an academic background, so as I came into the research software community, still driving scientific research, I still held a lot of these preconceived notions about what was important, what your internal value should be, which is something I'm working on changing, but sort of publication and the citations on those publications is often seen as the be-all and end-all within the academic sphere, and I think for the context, we're sat at RSE just after Simon Hettrick's keynote, where he talked about the ref and then the hidden ref, and this sort of huge imbalance of everything that's submitted as for the government to judge the outputs, the success of universities, whilst these other options exist, books, teaching outputs, software, collaborations, outreach, there's this huge bias that just goes on papers and citations. But as I'm sure many of your listeners will know, this is the top-level surface, and there's so much more that underpins all of this scientific research.
Indeed.
So I think part of my interest coming into it was to say, now I'm working in a different area, and suddenly I can see that there is this gap in acknowledging all the work that goes into something and everything that's behind it, but also thinking about the way software holds up research, or the way software props up research, versus the way that research is communicated. Is sort of one has moved on a lot and the other has not. So I think the example I gave in my Emerging Voices talk last year was we do write these papers, they're now electronic PDFs, very few journals are in print. They are still just these static artifacts that sit with paragraphs and links and plots of the data, but they are still just pieces of paper that people read.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's changing a little bit also in that direction, because we now have different books. I mean, there is, for instance, the Journal of Open Source Software and others. And there are also electronic books and electronic journals where you can actually have, dynamic tables, and you can play a little bit where you get responses depending on what kind of input parameters you have. There is Jupyter Notebook and Jupyter Books. There is something called MIST, which is used to embed LaTeX or tech in Jupyter Notebooks, I believe. I haven't worked with that. I have worked with LaTeX in my past, but not with MIST. So there are some kind of avenues in how publications themselves can change.
Yeah, so I think we couldn't have this conversation without talking about JOS, or both JOS and JOSE, which is the Journal of Open Source Software and the Journal of Open Source Education. So I should say also I am now an editor for the Journal of Open Source Software, and there is currently a call out for more editors to join the board, and I've also reviewed for that in the past, and anyone can get involved with signing up to be a reviewer. And I think this is an effort that's looked at this problem and said, there's all this software that's being developed and huge amounts of time go into developing this, but it's then only the graphs or the research conclusions that come out of this that actually get put into a paper, and then that paper that gathers citations and is looked at by universities to say, here we are, this is a thing that we think is good. So the way JOS is sort of seeking to address that is slightly different to the approach taken by the hidden ref, which is to say, how can we actually get better acknowledgement for these other resources? The approach JOS has taken is to say, well, if the language the universities want to speak is papers and citations, how do we make it possible to ascribe attribution, ascribe citations to these pieces of software? And so one thing you could do is anyone can attach a DOI to something through, say, Zenodo or Figshare or another repository hoard. But I think that the problem with these is a lot of people will say Zenodo is where code or Zenodo is where data goes to die, which is people will archive it, they'll attach a DOI.
I'm not quite sure they would put it like that.
Maybe edit around that. But you attach this static DOI and someone will maybe point to it for something. Often they'll say the code is available at this DOI. And this just then sits there as this static link, and it doesn't really accrue anything. And so the route JOS has sort of taken is to say, we'll take a short paper that describes our software, describes the need for it, describes the uses, but then it will be peer-reviewed. So we'll have 2 or 3 people come and look at the software and evaluating not what's written in text and what you've said about it, but they'll actually go in and look at the software quality side of things? How is the documentation? Is there sort of good testing? Does it satisfy a research purpose? And is it something that more researchers could come along and build on top of? But then there is this paper artifact attached to it, which can now accrue citations and be pointed at, speaking the language of universities that they can look at and point and say, here is something that is a valuable research output, is accruing acknowledgements. And I should say for educational resources, there's this equivalent, which is the Journal of Open Source Education.
Yeah.
So for things like your Jupyter books, if you've developed a short course in something that's been designed to be reused several times.
Are you involved in that as well?
I've reviewed for that, and I've had a course we developed for Introduction to Machine Learning.
Yeah.
We've had that published through that, and we found it a really fulfilling experience because it also gave us a push to kind of finalize and wrap these materials into a nice format. And we've sort of seen the benefit from that of, because we put the effort in to make this a good publishable resource, actually it has now been reused several times at various summer schools. I spoke to someone here who was actually using a derivative of that course to teach some stuff at RSE this week. So I think JOS is good in that it provides this academic currency and it wraps research software in a format that can be understood by researchers, or the more traditional approach. I think the other thing that I wanted to talk on was, you talked about sort of the idea of Jupyter notebooks, and what people will often refer to these as is the umbrella term of executable papers.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
And I think there's been several initiatives. So there was one within the biosciences, which I think has gone a little bit quiet. I think one of the first times I came across it is in the geosciences domain, which is where my background's from. Perhaps the biggest conference, the American Geophysical Union, has run a couple of times a project they call Notebooks Now. And the idea is that if you've got...
Yeah, I've heard of that. I think that I went to a Jupyter conference in 23 or 24.
And the idea is if you've got a paper that's being presented at the conference or a poster or something else, not only can you present this paper, present some figures, some pictures, but actually can you show us the code you use to generate these figures, the code you use to process this data, to generate these conclusions, from that, so that it's truly reproducible. I, as a user, could come along, rerun that, and see where everything comes from, much more transparent. Building on that, there's a recent initiative that's coming from Germany.
And you're looking it up now.
I'm trying to look it up. I can't remember. I think it's a collaboration between several universities, but it's the ORKG initiative. Specifically, they call it Reborn Articles. And the idea they're taking is trying to do this again, which is to say you shouldn't just upload this PDF of your paper, but actually we want to pull out key statements, tie those key statements of the paper back to a graph or a chart or a table, and then we want to see how was that chart or table generated from the raw data. So there's a much more transparent way of tracing these statements. And the idea that they're after is to build these up as a database such that you could then take these statements or these data outputs, and if you do, say, a meta-study that builds on several of these, that becomes traceable all the way back through the full pipeline.
So we spend a lot more effort nowadays on the method section of a paper, shall we say, because, with scientific papers have this method section where it's supposed to be explaining what you did, how you did it, so that people can say, your conclusions based on the results that you presented make sense based on the methods that you used. But as methods turn to be more and more complicated and sometimes merit their own papers, it becomes more and more difficult to actually have just a quick paragraph on that, or maybe even more. So executable papers is one thing, but I think it strikes me as odd that we have, there are two expectations from papers, right? One is to actually communicate results on how you did it, and the other one is to actually evaluate it to get money. And I think these are two very different interests. The universities are interested in it because it allows them to say, well, look at what we've done, and, could we have perhaps this pot of money for our next research project? The scientist wants to say, okay, well, here's what I've done. Have a look at it, see what I've done right, and maybe somebody else can use it to build on that. So how do we marry these two rather conflicting things? And do you think that having something like the hidden ref, where we acknowledge that software is a valuable research output for the evaluation process?
Oh, that's a really good question.
And not an easy one, I'm sorry.
So I think it touches on a really interesting point, which almost falls back down to some of these root challenges with the academic system, the attribution system, and the way people approach code and software, which is there's very little incentive, and I think there's been a lot of work that's been done. It's getting much, much better. But for many, as you say, the goal we work towards is having this paper that goes out and communicates something, and we don't really worry about how we got there. How was our data cleaning? How efficient was it? How reproducible could it be for someone to do this in 3 months' time? And so there's a couple of things I want to pull out. One is, you said that for scientists it's about communicating these results, but also enabling others to build on top of that. And I think this is one of the... People often talk about kind of the reproducibility crisis in science, of these methods are often now so high level or abstractly described, but there's so much devil in the details of how you implemented something, sort of what algorithms did you choose, what discretizations did you use, what data filtering techniques did you apply. And it shouldn't be difficult because all of this is embedded in code in a text file somewhere. And so I think this is one thing that can be addressed through talking about just reproducibility. But I think the difficulty is convincing people, the people who need to care about the reproducibility, convincing them that it's important, and putting something in place to better measure this, or better, I'm hesitant to use the word police it, but sort of to say, an example being, I guess, with the Journal of Open Source Software is part of that peer review process, unlike perhaps a traditional article where people would just take what's written in a PDF at face value and not really question how these graphs have got there. A big part of that peer review process is actually to go hands-on. Can I download this code? Can I install it? Can I use it and run it to do what it says it should do? And evaluate that usability, and therefore, indeed, could someone come along and use this to do something? So I think another part of this is, I like to make this distinction between research code and research software. And so you'll have perhaps some code that was used to produce results of that paper. It will perhaps be used once. It was written for a very, very specific purpose. And I like to distinguish that from research software, which is someone's written some code to do some scientific work, but in a more general sense. And they're now perhaps looking to reuse this more widely within a research group or across research groups. And I think it's becoming easier to demonstrate that if you put the effort in to do that, to make this reusable, to make it in a state that people can use it, and therefore people want to reuse it, with a growing awareness of GitHub, GitLab, looking for open source solutions, looking through, say, the Python package index or sort of the Julia options or whatever your favorite language is, the packages that are made available for that. I think with a growing awareness of that, if you can make the effort to take your research code, turn it into research software, people will start using this, and if you've put the time in to make it usable, make it good, you'll start picking up a lot of recognition, a lot of attribution. If you have it published somewhere, picking up the citations there, and I think this can become almost more powerful than a paper because you can build so many different things off it, not just a direct follow-up study, but people will start using it for all sorts of things you perhaps never imagined.
Some of what we talked about in this episode is very specific to the UK, like the REF process, for instance. Which is not to say that science isn't being assessed and evaluated in other countries. Of course it is, but the processes might vary. So, could what's happening in the UK be relevant to those in other parts of the world? For that, let me briefly return to Simon Hettrick. On an international level, because REF is obviously very UK-specific, I mean, the process is very UK-specific. I guess that funding questions and evaluations go on in other countries as well. But how much can that actually, your kind of grassroots movement, do you think, can be adopted in other areas?
Well, so we've already had people who are interested, which is good. Right? So, I mean, this happened with RSE as well. We started it in the UK, the first ever RSE conference in 2016. A bunch of German RSEs met up for the first time, and they were like, oh, we're all here. We should be doing this in Germany. And they went off and they set up the German RSE Association. And then it just built from there. Now RSE is in 14 different countries and groups of countries. And I can see the hidden ref going the same way. Ref is UK. A few other countries have a sort of a similar thing, but what every country has is this problem. It's just that the UK has a way of measuring it through the ref. But if you go to any, as I say, any research economy, you will find one that's focused entirely on publications where people who are vital are being overlooked, and the incentives are skewing the kind of research that's going on.
Changing and updating the way we evaluate science is, of course, not the only thing people worry about. There's a lot of effort being put into making science more transparent, for instance, and accessible, like the FAIR initiative, FAIR for findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And indeed all of the other movements and initiatives that fall under the open science umbrella. And it's easy to get impatient and worry about that little progress is being made, but things do happen. As Simon mentioned earlier, only a few years ago we didn't have research software engineering. And look at it now. We have groups and jobs opening up all over the place. So we just have to keep going, don't we? And change will ultimately come. Just at the end, a quick note of what's coming up next week. I want to shine a light on a form of computing that's often overlooked and perhaps not even recognized as such, that of analog computers. If you want to find out more, tune in next week. Thanks for listening. Oh, time's up. See you next time. But before I forget, this podcast is covered by the Creative Commons license. See ya.